Recording in progress. Good mid-afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's final mid-afternoon masterclass, one of the marquee events of the University of Melbourne's 10th Annual Science Festival as part of National Science Week. My name is Julia and I will be your host for today's masterclass. As a host, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we are filming, the Wurundjeri people. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are this country's first scientists with deep and enduring knowledge of the land, waters and skies. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I welcome all First Nations people here today. In making this acknowledgement, we commit to respectful and responsible conduct towards all others according to the traditional laws of this land, particularly at times of formal ceremony. Today we are coming to you live from the Lisa Belair House, which is a residential hall owned by the University of Melbourne and named after the late Aboriginal and South Sea Islander artist, academic, activist and past student Lisa Belair. During the uni semester, this place is home to about 285 students. And today's topic, as you all know, is the science of beer and winemaking in a changing climate with Dr. Charles Pagel and Billy Zinus. Thank you so much for joining us today, both of you. So Charles here has worked as a researcher at the University of London and the University of Melbourne, where he lectures in agricultural molecular science. His research interests include genome stability and gene regulation in yeast, but I have been told many other interests, of course. And Billy teaches wine and viticulture subjects at the University of Melbourne, splitting his time between here in Parkville and the Dookie campus. He's completing a PhD investigating adaptation strategies in winemaking practices for a changing Australian climate. So, welcome again to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So, as some of you might know if you've been part of these masterclasses for the week, how today will work, Billy and Charles will do a 20-minute presentation about their work, and then we'll throw to you, our audience, for some questions, and we'll finish up about 2:45. Now, to ask a question, just open up the chat and put it in there, and the chat's there open for any other comments, clapping emojis, cheering emoji, wine emojis, anything on theme that you'd like to add. Of course, but please be respectful in the chat as well. Now, to make sure everything is working, again, as you know, if you've been here to other masterclasses, this is what we do at the start. Please open up the chat and just write in where you are zooming in from, whether it be your suburb or your city or your town or your country. It is a very international program, this one. So let's see how we're going. Okay, so we've got someone from Point Cook. I know we've had someone from Point Cook every single day, so I wonder if it's the same person. Indonesia, India, Shepparton, someone maybe from the Dookie campus. Nepal, the first time we've seen someone from Nepal. That's amazing. Welcome. Ballarat, Preston, all over. There you go. Lots of people interested in your work today. So, without further ado, Charles, I might hand over to you to get started.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I'll just point out on this slide is the university's winery at the Dookie campus. This is actually one of the oldest still functioning wineries in Australia. So this is where we teach a lot of the brewing, winemaking subjects, and where Billy did a lot of his PhD work. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical aspects of brewing and winemaking and how science has had a great impact on both those processes. And then Billy will talk a little bit about the work that he did for his PhD. So to start with, I'll answer the question, what is wine? Wine is essentially fermented grape juice. So the winemaker takes the grapes, crushes them, and releases the grape juice, which is quite rich in very simple sugars. And the yeast, which is found on the outside of the grape, ferments that simple sugar to form ethanol, alcohol, and carbon dioxide. So when you're making wine, you can either leave the skins intact with the fermenting grape juice to make a red wine, like we see in the top image on this slide, or you can take the skins out and produce a white wine. So the skill of the winemaker really is encouraging fermentation, alcoholic fermentation by the yeast. So the alcohol is produced, and that prevents the growth of other microorganisms, which would spoil the wine, making it unpalatable or even dangerous to drink. So beer obviously is another fermented beverage, but it has some important differences with wine. So here, rather than simple sugars in a fruit juice and grape juice, the carbohydrates that the yeast use in fermentation come from grains. So from grains like barley, oats, wheat, rye, etc. But the form that carbohydrate is in is not useful to the yeast. So in the grains, it's in the form of starch. So the grains have to be prepared by a controlled germination process called malting before they're used in the brewing process. So this malting process makes the starch available, and then the brewer, during the brewing process, converts that starch into sugar, and the yeast ferment the simple sugars to form alcohol. So in the top left-hand image of this slide, we see a range of different malts. So they've been dried after malting, and then they've been roasted as well to produce malts with different flavours and different colours. So as well as malt and water, we can see in the bottom image, the fourth ingredient, along with yeast in beer, are hops. And hops are a very interesting crop. They're produced in very tight geographical regions. And Australia, particularly the southern states of Victoria and Tasmania, are important producers of hops. So hops grow on very large trellising systems, so they can grow up to 6 metres tall. And the important part of the hop plant are the flowers or the cones that we can see in the top right image. So the cones contain a wide range of bioactive chemicals. They're added to beer primarily for flavour and aroma. So we get a lot of oils and resins that are important in the finished beer. So today we tend to think of beer and wine as non-essential or luxury goods, but for the last 10,000 years or more, that hasn't really been the case. So it's a very ancient staple food for a lot of human existence. Beer and wine have been important in terms of producing or giving nutrition. They've produced palatable, nutritious food, and this has led to beer in particular often being referred to as liquid bread. But also, for a long time, beer and wine have been considered to be the safe alternative to water. So historically, scientists, doctors didn't understand the role played by water in causing disease outbreaks. So a lot of germs are carried in water. At the time, people thought it was the air, the smell that carried the disease, not the water. So along with poor sanitation, many of the water supplies, particularly in large cities such as London, were contaminated with bacteria that caused diseases such as typhoid and cholera. So annually, thousands of people died in large outbreaks of diseases that were waterborne. So during the brewing process, the brewers boil the sugary liquid that's extracted from the grain, and this kills any bacteria that might be in the water supply. So it sterilises the beer. And then the process of fermentation, which produces ethanol, which is obviously antimicrobial, along with a decrease in pH and a decrease in the oxygen in the beer, helps preserve the water, prevent dangerous human pathogens growing in the finished beer as well. So understanding how beer and wine are produced has led to many different important scientific discoveries, as we'll see now. So, brewing and winemaking, in fact, represent two of the oldest forms of biotechnology. So that's using biological processes for industrial purposes. So it's believed that brewing and winemaking are at least 10,000 years old, and they are associated with the earliest forms of agriculture. So as hunter-gatherers settled down to become farmers, they took advantage of the crops that they domesticated, be they wild grasses to form the modern crops, grains such as wheat and barley, for example, or the grapes themselves. So the early farmers, the early brewers and winemakers would have had little understanding of the processes that were going on as the beer was brewed or the wine was fermented. It largely happened through a process of chance and also by trial and error. So the actual processes of fermentation themselves, they didn't understand what yeast were, they didn't understand the role. It was really regarded as a magical or divine transformation of a sugary liquid into something that was mildly intoxicating. So it wasn't really until the Enlightenment in the 1600s and then later the Industrial Revolution when scientists started to look at the processes of brewing and winemaking and understand what was going on during these processes. So some of the earliest observations were made by a gentleman called Anton van Leeuwenhoek in the 1600s, who was using a very early form of microscope that he designed to look at very small objects. So he was looking at the process of fermentation, which you can obviously see macroscopically, so you can see the bubbling and foaming of beer and wine as it starts to ferment. But he was able to see small particles in this fermentation. So at the time, he didn't know what they were, didn't know they were yeast, didn't know they were living organisms even. He believed they were particles formed from the grain. It wasn't until the 1800s that scientists realised, in fact, that they were yeast and that they were a live, living cell. So during the 1800s, a great deal of understanding was gained about winemaking and brewing, and one of the foremost scientists of this age was Louis Pasteur, a French father of modern biochemistry and also microbiology, and a lot of his early work was looking at problems associated with winemaking and brewing. So he made a number of very important discoveries, not least of all that fermentation itself was a living process. Previous to Louis Pasteur, a lot of scientists believe that fermentation really was a chemical breakdown of sugar to form alcohol. Louis Pasteur showed that it was a living process and it was associated with yeast growth in the absence of oxygen. So it was a form of anaerobic respiration. Not only that, Louis Pasteur also did a lot of work and showed that spoilage of both beer and wine occurred due to microbiological contamination. So other bacteria growing in the fermenting beer could outcompete the yeast and spoil the beer or wine. And then finally, Louis Pasteur also gave his name to a very important process which we associate more with milk production these days, but is also used and was initially used for wine and beer production, and that's pasteurisation, which is the idea that you can heat a liquid up to a high temperature, not necessarily boiling, for a short period of time, and that will kill sufficient microbiological contamination to ensure the shelf life of the product, be it milk or wine or beer. But there were also a number of other scientific discoveries that came about as a result of studying winemaking and brewing. Emil Hansen, for example, who did most of his work at the Carlsberg Brewery Laboratories in Denmark, was one of the first scientists to isolate pure cultures of microorganisms. So he cultured pure cultures of yeast, which has led to a greater understanding of the genomics of yeast, and also the ability to isolate yeast with different properties for different scientific or different technological processes. A lot of the early work as well on enzymes and metabolic pathways as well were conducted using cell-free extracts, so we're using yeast that were broken apart, and then we could study the individual cellular reactions that lead to the formation of these metabolic pathways in cells. Also, other examples are the pH scale, which was developed by another scientist at the Carlsberg Brewery Laboratories, SPL Sorensen, which describes the acidity or alkalinity of a solution, which is very important in both brewing and winemaking. And then finally, another example is the use in statistics of students' t-tests. So student was a name taken on by a researcher at Dublin Guinness Brewery, and he developed the student's t-test, which many scientists use today to look for statistical significance between two groups. So as well as that, there are a whole load of other examples of scientific advances that have come about as a result of brewing and winemaking. These also included understanding the process of germination and also the process of malting, which relies a lot on the presence of enzymes in the grain. The control of fermentation, so how we can control fermentation to produce particular products. Breeding of new varieties of both hops and also grains as well that are disease or drought resistant. Understanding the chemistry of hops. So as I said, hops produce a wide range of bioactive chemicals, and we're starting to understand the effects of some of those other chemicals that are produced by hops as well. Also isolating and breeding new strains of yeast. So as I said, the yeast that can be isolated, we're starting to understand the processes of hybridization and also domestication on the yeast and isolating different yeasts with different properties. And then finally, on this slide, we have adapting agricultural and processing practices to a changing environment. So how we can change the process to adapt to the current changes in the environment. And really that's what Billy is going to go on and talk about of his PhD thesis.
Thanks, Charles. So I'm going to take you on a little journey of all things enology, which is the chemistry of winemaking and really my specialisation at the University of Melbourne here. And the always fun task of condensing the last 4 years of my research life into 4 minutes. So Charles already touched on this, but what is wine? Wine is grapes and grapes alone. So when you hear people talk about, wine tasting like boysenberries or strawberries or passion fruit or any of those funny descriptors, they're really just telling you that there are esters or flavours that are similar to those food products or remind you of those food products. But the essence of wine is always and only grapes. So wine composition has a few components. Mostly it's water. There's a small percentage of ethanol, and that usually ranges from about 10 to 15%. And then a really interesting thing, which is everything else, where all of the flavours, acids, and things that make up that liquid beverage that we call wine. And that starts from the vineyard, which is what we're interested in as winemakers, because essentially we are agriculturalists, we are farmers. We make grapes, and grapes, therefore, they're following make wine. A ripe grape is mostly water. It has sugars, simple sugars, fructose and glucose, like Charles said. And then these other components like the skins and seeds, where a lot of flavours and aromatics come from that contribute to the winey taste of any wine. And the unique thing about wine as well is that we actually have thousands of these things called grape varieties that all look and taste and smell differently to each other. So that is, Pinot Noir is a grape variety that is different to Chardonnay. And one phenological attribute that's different between those two grape varieties is that Pinot Noir is red and Chardonnay is white, and they're following the wines that we make out of them are red or white. And so from a climate perspective, everything about the climate, terrain, sunlight, oxygen levels, altitude, soil types, rainfall contribute to the different growing conditions of grapes, thereby affecting grape qualities, and that will have the knock-on effect to impact wine qualities, colour, alcohol, sweetness, ripeness, flavours. And my research really focused on how climate, or a changing climate in an Australian context, is affecting grape composition and then also affecting wine composition and quality. And so what we see or have seen in Australia over many decades now is hotter growing conditions overall through many of our winemaking regions. And during the normal ripening of grapes, we see an increase in sugar concentrations and a decrease in acidity concentrations. And if you look at that graph on the top right-hand side there, there's this red line, which is sort of arbitrary, but there's this idea of flavour potential in the grapes coming to a maximum and thereafter declining. So our job as viticulturalists and winemakers is to try and pick grapes at that optimum sugar, acid and flavour combination. But what's happening in an increasingly warmer climate is we're seeing greater or more rapid accumulation of sugars in grapes. We're seeing a more rapid decrease in acidity and changes in other aromatic profiles of grapes. And the graph in the bottom right-hand corner there shows in a really simplified way that where this ideal peak of flavour now sits is actually quite a lot later than where the ideal point of sugar and acid balance sits. So we're getting a bit of a misalignment of these three attributes that we're trying to balance. So why does it matter? Well, if we have more sugar accumulation, which is what my research really focuses on, we're going to end up with a wine with higher alcohol concentration because grape sugars are converted into alcohol through alcoholic fermentation by yeast. And to some consumers, that might sound like a great thing, more alcohol in my wine, great. But actually, what we've found through the research is that actually consumers have an aversion to overly ethanolic wine products, either through health concerns, but also through personal preference of taste through some taste testing that we've done at the university. So my research specifically focuses on this idea of how winemakers are adapting to the effects of a changing Australian climate. And of this topic, there are several approaches that can be taken, but we specifically focus on this idea of pre-fermentation winemaking processes. So what can we do before we've made the wine to intervene and make the best quality wine possible in the context of this changing climate? And the answer that we investigated and what we found, we'll see in a second, is actually water or water additions pre-fermentation. Now, this is quite topical in an Australian context because there was actually an amendment to the Australia-New Zealand Food Standards Act in 2017, which allows now for winemakers to add water into grape must, which is the grape juice prior to fermentation, in order to lower sugar concentration. So if we add water, we're diluting down the sugar concentrations. Now, that's a simple approach to reducing sugar and therefore alcohol, but there's not much in the way of research as to how adding water into our wines essentially will affect the quality of those wines. And as a country, we don't want to make lower quality wines, we want to make the best quality possible. So the experiment follows this logic. We harvested at an early time during the harvest period, i.e. low sugar, and with lower sugar, we made a lower alcohol wine at 13.5% alcohol. We harvested a bit later, and we fermented those grapes normally without any water addition, made a slightly higher alcohol wine, 14.5%. But we also cut back the sugar to make a lower alcohol wine back at 13.5%. And then we harvested even later again and we had incremental water dilutions of some treatments or none at all. So we ended up with 3 different wines of differing alcohols. And so what we end up with is these different treatment groups that we've got here, 6 treatment groups with 3 different alcohol levels achieved either by the time that we harvested them or by the amount of water that we added into the juice prior to fermentation. And we found out some really interesting things. To bring that graph back up, essentially what we're doing is we're picking at the ideal time for flavour development, but we're adjusting everything back in terms of chemically where the sugars and acids should be. So we're shifting everything back with that water dilution, and we're not compromising flavour. And what we saw is that there's a couple of effects of that. The water addition can help us address the fact that we're not picking too early, where we might have underripe fruit flavours if we pick really early. And also, we're not picking too late, where we might have overripe characters and excessively ethanolic wines as well. And what I referred to earlier is one of our findings is this thing called hotness or heat on the palate attributed to ethanol in wine is actually one of the least desirable attributes in a wine when we tested it with panelists. So if a wine is too hot with too much alcohol, people actually tend not to prefer the wines, and it can be really detrimental to their perception of quality of those wines. And what we found was actually of our treatments, that really late pick, which had really high hotness, when adjusted with water, came out much more preferential than without it. And some more findings as well in that middle harvest, we were able to, what it says here is preserve chemical compounds and favourable sensory attributes, which just means that we were able to achieve picking at that time where it's ideal flavour ripeness, but then we were able to adjust back that excess hotness that people were perceiving by using water addition. So people also preferred that middle harvest timing with water addition as well. So in all cases, we found that of all those 6 treatments, the 2 most preferred were wines with water additions. And that's a really significant finding in terms of being able to turn around to winemakers in Australia and say, hey, look, if you do use moderate amounts of water addition, it not only will not have detrimental impacts on your wine quality, but actually people kind of prefer it. And this, in the context of the global wine industry, is quite significant also. Whilst we're the first country to legalise the use of water additions into grape must to reduce ethanol levels, we would expect that other countries may follow after us. So to have this preliminary research out there that shows some really encouraging signs that consumers do prefer these wines and we can create wines of higher quality using this method, these might be findings that could be implemented and used or taken into consideration in other wine industries around the world as well. And this is also a strategy that can be implemented right now in the context of Australia. I referred to some other adaptation strategies where some other colleagues are doing work in researching how best we can offset the effects of climate change in Australia in the wine industry. But this is something that we can do now, and we can make positive change in terms of wine quality in Australia as well. So that sort of brings to a close my little talk about my research there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's fascinating, all the intricacies of something that I think a lot of us know about and probably have a few drinks every now and again. But yeah, so thank you so much for your work and thank you so much for your presentation as well. We've already got heaps of questions coming in, so there's a lot of interest in all the work that you're doing. So we might jump straight into those ones. Charles, I might start with you for a couple of them, obviously with your first presentation. One from Beck. So how is baker's yeast different to brewer's yeast?
There's 2 main forms of yeast that's used in brewing. One is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the baker's yeast, which is the ale yeast. So that's one type of beer that's produced. The other is Saccharomyces pastorianus, named after Louis Pasteur, which is different to baker's yeast. It's a cold-tolerant yeast. It's a hybrid of two other yeasts, in fact. But there's no difference between baker's yeast, winemaker's yeast, and ale yeast. They're all the same species. They just have the different strains of those yeasts produce different products and have different uses.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So same, but different. Okay. A couple of others. So from Kieran now. So interesting that the yeast comes from the outside of the grape. I found that very interesting too. That's what kept in my mind. So do wines ever have carefully selected yeast added rather than just relying on what is naturally there? Oh, there.
Yeah, I might
really
take
can
this
answer.
one.
Yep.
Yes, so wine, if you've ever looked at grapes, and even grapes in the supermarket, which are actually a different type of grape than we use for winemaking, they always have what is referred to as a bloom on the outside, which is sort of this powdery or waxy coating. That's not a wax that's been applied by a farmer or something like that. That's actually a yeast bloom on the outside that's naturally present on the outside of grapes. So you can just crush grapes up and they will start fermenting on their own, which is likely how we discovered the product of wine and its origin. But we also can use cultured yeast, and we use Saccharomyces cerevisiae as an inoculated yeast. And in terms of commercial production, there are some people that allow for wine to ferment naturally on its own with the native yeasts that are present, but also quite a number of people who use cultured yeast to have a more reliable output in terms of fermentation dynamics.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Very good. Thank you for your question. I might stick with you, Billy. So one from Beck. How accurate are human wine tasters? This is interesting. So when they say they can, I know you mentioned all the tasting, the palates and the different flavours, but obviously it's just from the grape. But they can taste blackberry, for example. Are they consistently identifying a particular chemical in the wine?
Yes, they are. All of the flavours that are perceived have some sort of chemical volatile origin, some of which we have isolated, some we haven't. So to follow that, in something like the grape variety Sauvignon Blanc, when Sauvignon Blanc, the grape, is grown in cooler climates, it has high accumulated levels of a chemical compound called methoxypyrazines. Methoxypyrazines are also in high concentrations of green vegetative products, so grass, the stems of foliage, capsicums have very high methoxypyrazines. So when somebody smells a glass of Sauvignon Blanc and says, this smells like green capsicum, it's because they've experienced that aroma before in green capsicums. Yeah. Can people be very accurate at it? Yes is the answer, though smell and taste is always a unique experience to each individual. So what we do when we do tastings on a professional level, you always taste with other people because you get a more consistent result, and we do that in wine judging. And then I know that I'm actually agnostic to the smell of raspberries. Indole is a specific chemical compound in raspberries that I can't smell, but I know that other people can. So we taste in groups, or in the context of research, we had over 200 panelists tasting wines. So the idea is to even out the results and get a consistent response. Yeah.
Amazing. That's so fascinating. And actually, I'm just going to jump down to another question because they touched on some of the tasting as well. So Gayatri, so why is it that with different wine preferences, be it white, red and rosé, you might have already answered this, but I'll just see if there's any extension to it. So whereas some people completely hate wine, can we relate it to the fact that we've got different genomic sequencing, or is it something gene related? I guess, is our taste buds gene related?
Well, I haven't done any research in terms of people's perception of wines and preference on a gene level. But I guess it comes down to things like past experience and continued experience and how much you've been exposed to things. And you can apply the same logic to what people enjoy in food or other things that they consume on a day-to-day basis, whether that be you like sweet juices, or you quite enjoy dry tonic water. Some people don't like it. They find it really bitter. And the same thing happens in wine. We have and beer as well. There's a tremendous array of different styles of wine and beer. And so some people just have a preference for one more than the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
To say there is a genetic basis as well to people that can't detect certain chemicals like Billy. So there is underlying genetics there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Good assumption there. Charles, I'll come back to you. So this is an interesting one. So in terms of you gave a bit more of a history, this is probably a bit more of an opinion. Do you think wine tasted better or worse in ancient times?
I would imagine.
This one from Tip, thank you.
I would imagine it tasted a lot worse because it wasn't as sanitised. So you would have wild yeast in there producing all different types of chemicals. And the general sanitation of the product probably wouldn't have been, but at least it wouldn't have killed you.
Yes, indeed. Okay, and then so next one from Beck. I think we touched on this a little bit, but I guess maybe we can go into it. So what determines the alcohol content of beer and wine, both of them, and I guess maybe the percentage of, maybe that's what Beck was saying? Yeah.
Alcohol by volume, it's essentially the amount of sugar.
Yep.
So different yeasts will ferment the same amount of sugar to a different extent, but in general, if you put more simple sugars in there, you'll get more alcohol formed.
There you go. And same thing for wine, is that?
Yeah, exactly. Just how much sugar you have to start with, which is why my research looks at reducing sugars prior to fermentation. And if you can reduce the sugar concentration, you'll reduce the final alcohol concentration.
Yep, awesome. Okay, one for you, Billy. So another one from Gayatri. Thank you for the multiple questions. What is your take on the neurological disadvantage of alcohol when many believe that a glass of wine is healthy for people? But I guess maybe is a glass of wine healthy for people is also the question. In addition, another guest asked, what's healthier, beer and wine? Okay, maybe we'll go with the first one about the balance of the one glass of wine is healthy.
I think I'm going to steer clear of this question because I'm not a medical practitioner and I don't have any research in the field of wine and health. I mostly look at wine sensory analysis and people's perceptions of that. So I don't really have a comment on if it's good for you.
Fair enough. We might bypass that one. Okay, next one. One for you, Billy. So should winemakers or brewers design products for the most common consumers' taste preference or for niche markets? Maybe this is more of a business question. We're going broad spectrum on all these questions. Bit of a business model question.
Well, the answer is they do.
Yeah,
because why would anyone make something that no one's going to buy unless you have a lot of money to throw around and don't necessarily have any primary objective to make money. So people do make wines based on what the largest consumer market will buy, and they also make wines that are for niche markets as well. And we could simplify that into price points. In terms of flagons of wine, if we talk about the old bag-in-box wine, it's not the highest quality wine, but if it were bad, people wouldn't buy it by the 4-litre bag full. So there is a market for that style of wine, and that's perhaps a large market, but there's also a market for Penfolds Grange, which sells at $1,000 a bottle, and one might think that that is quite a niche market, the people that are willing to spend that much money on wine.
Yeah. Indeed.
I think in terms of brewing as well, you can see that with the recent craft brewing phenomenon. Small independent brewers producing very different types of beer compared to the traditional larger brewers that tend to produce a fairly bland, if I may say that, form of beer to sell it to as many people as possible.
Yeah, indeed. Good answers. And I guess that's another question for business-minded people as well. Okay, so now on to one from Luella. So how will Australia and other semi-arid regional winemakers navigate the industry in the face of climate change as water becomes more scarce? I guess that's one for you, Billy.
Well, it's more of a viticultural question in terms of water becoming more scarce. But there are a lot of examples globally of grape varieties that are grown without irrigation. And in fact, Australia sort of not sits alone, but it's more common to grow without irrigation, where in the Australian context we grow with irrigation. And what another adaptation strategy is toward climate changes is that I'm not personally researching in, but there is a lot of research being done, is changing to some of these different grape varieties that are grown in more arid climates around the world. So the grapes that first came over into Australia came with the first fleet. And there were a lot of classic French grape varietals, Shiraz, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc. And they weren't necessarily the most apt choice for our Australian climate. And so what we're looking to now is, what are people growing in arid climates globally? Something like Tempranillo as a grape variety comes to mind, that's grown in Rioja in northern Spain. And that perhaps is one adaptation strategy, changing the variety that you're growing in order to adapt to things like water stress or drought. In terms of actually using water to dilute wine, that's a small volume in the total water use of a grapevine and the journey of getting it into bottle though.
Yeah, interesting. Just on what you were saying as well in terms of changing the variety, shout out to Joe who asked a similar question. So Australia's famous for Shiraz, and it's interesting to find out the background of that too. And so do you think the impacts of climate change on grape varieties will change our focus in the future? So I guess following on from that, like, do you see a specific, other than Tempranillo or?
Oh, it already is changing. People are already doing that. It's just a very slow process. So I'm focusing on something that can be done now. But to use an example of a winemaker that I know, Jim Barry out in the Clare Valley, he went to Santorini and he found this grape variety that's commonly grown there called Assyrtiko. Now, Assyrtiko grows dry without irrigation on a very arid, small island, Santorini. And he thought this would be a brilliant grape variety to be able to grow where he's from in the Clare Valley. And from inception of that idea, it was in 2008, he then had to bring over a mother vine, which went into 3 years of quarantine, which then he planted out and had to propagate to a sizable amount in his vineyard. And then also you don't get a crop on a vine for the first 3 years. And then on top of that, you don't get a quality crop for up to 10 years. 2021, I believe, was the first release of the Assyrtiko by Jim Barry. So it was an 11-year journey from the inception of trying a new grape variety to actually having a bottle of wine on the dinner table. So it's a very slow process, but people are doing it.
Yeah, interesting. There you go. Okay, so now on to interesting non-alcoholic beer and wine. I don't know what we can talk about that, but Amrita, so I've come across non-alcoholic wine, but I also say beer as well. Does it really have zero alcohol content? And perhaps what's the background of the non-alcoholic variety?
Non-alcoholic is legally anything with less than 0.5% alcohol.
Ah, there you go. Okay.
So even orange juice, if you leave it for long enough, will ferment. So
watch out.
Potentially you can get small levels of alcohol even in a ripe banana or a couple of day old orange juice. So it's not actually 0%.
Yeah.
It's less than 0.5% alcohol by volume.
There you go. And same for wine.
Same for wine also, yeah.
There you go. Very good. I'd love to, I might just slightly pivot the questions to, I guess, about your own work. It's like, I'm sure everyone would love to know a little bit more about, your day-to-day and, I guess, what you love about the work that you do. Maybe I'll start with you, Charles.
Well, by training, I'm a biochemist. So, my undergraduate degree was in biological sciences, majoring in biochemistry. I do a lot of research in the fields of muscle and bone disease as well. And I've had an interest in brewing since being an undergraduate, being interested in biological processes. So taking on the subjects at the University of Melbourne, where we teach brewing, has been great because it's been able to. It's got me back into one of my first interests in biological sciences, I guess.
Absolutely. Well, being able to research something that you're truly passionate about, I mean, that's the dream, I guess. What about you, Billy?
Well, I actually started my journey in wine as an undergraduate student at the University of Melbourne, doing a Bachelor of Science, thinking I was going to become a veterinarian. And I actually did the subjects that I now teach. We teach several subjects relating to wine sensory analysis, wine making, and broadly about wine in the context of Australia and the world. And it really sparked an interest of mine, and I went on to do a master's in viticulture and enology, as well as a PhD now in enology, and have come back on board with the University of Melbourne to teach back into those subjects that inspired me in the first place. So I really get a lot out of teaching and inspiring the next generation of winemakers that are to come.
Absolutely. That's so great. Well, we've come to the end. So thank you so much, both of you, for your presentations and all your insights and a little bit of an idea about your backgrounds as well. It's been fascinating and so many questions came through. So clearly the audience were very interested in what you do. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone out there for tuning in today and for all week. This is the final masterclass and really the end of Science Festival for 2024. So thank you for joining us over the last 5 days. It's been wonderful to bring you just a small snapshot of the incredible science happening here at the University of Melbourne. Now, we have been recording all these events and the recordings will be up on the website in the coming weeks. But other than that, thank you. Thank you once again. Thank you for joining us. And look, we'll see you next year, I guess. Time to crack open a bottle of wine, I think. Bye.